Hi everyone. I hope you're doing great and that you had an amazing Thanksgiving holiday. I hope you had fun with your family and your friends, ate some good food, had a good time, and you're ready to tackle the rest of the semester. We are getting close to the end of the semester, so I hope you come back all refreshed and ready to finish the semester strong, right? Okay, so so as I promised last time that we met, that I would be making a video which would um, complete the supply chain coordination. Specifically, uh, we were going to look at a buyback contract. So in today's class, what we're going to do is explore some contracts that coordinate a supply chain and also look at some buyback contracts, right? So as you might recall, in the last class, what we were doing was understanding the bullwhip effect. And the bullwhip effect is essentially an increase in the demand variability as we move upstream. So if we have a retailer who is purchasing from a wholesaler, who purchases from a distributor, who in turn gets their product from the factory or the manufacturer, um, then in this case, the retailer gets the information of demand from the consumer, right? And then the retailer transmits this information as they move. The retailer transmits this demand information to the wholesaler does it to the distributor, and then the distributor does it to the material. So the forward flow is material flow, and then the backward flow is information flow, right? So what we saw was that as we move upstream, if there is like a small blip in the consumer demand, right? If something like this happened in the consumer demand, then as we move up, the variability keeps on increasing. All right. So the manufacturer sees a really big increase and decrease in the demand. So the variability is very high, whereas the variability here was very small, right? So this is what we refer to as bullwhip. So it's literally like, as this guy is doing, as the supply chain manager here is, does a small snap in the demand, and then as we move upstream, it goes on increasing, right? It just goes on increasing. So that's what bullwhip effect means. Now, we looked at some of the causes of bullwhip effect. We saw order batching, synchronization, trade promotions like buy one get one or 20% discount. These kind of things lead to forward buying behavior, and then we also saw this idea of shortage gaming. So these are some of the causes of bullwhip effect. So make sure that you understand all of these causes and why they cause bullwhip. Then next we understood the consequences. So we understood that, hey, this increase in demand variability actually is inefficient. It leads to inefficient production or an excessive inventory. It could also lead to poor customer service due to stockouts, right? And then when we were playing the beer game, we experienced these things. That as the demand variability was increasing, the going from the retailer to the wholesaler to the factory, that demand variability was increasing, right? And there were stockouts. There was not enough material that the retailer had at their shelf, to satisfy the customer demand. So once we understood the causes and the consequences, we thought, okay, well, this is a bad thing. Clearly, it's inefficient. How do we remedy this? So in order to remedy it, we understood that information sharing is the foremost method of reducing the bullwhip effect. And if you recall, we spoke about this when we were playing the game that I wish I could talk to the factory, or I wish I could share better information with the other supply chain partners, right? So once everybody in the supply chain, the retailer, the wholesaler, the distributor, and the factory know what the actual consumer demand is, then they can respond accordingly. They do not need to respond to, this artificial increase in the supply, in the demand variability. Okay. And then we also talked about smoothing the orders, which meant that, hey, if you place an order only on a Monday and then don't place any orders until Friday, if you place an order of 100 on Monday and then 0 on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, then instead of that, why don't you place the orders a little more uniformly so that the demand variability is not introduced. Then also, eliminating these pathological incentives like trade promotions, which give people a reason to forward buy or to suddenly increase their orders or the demand for the partner upstream. And then we also spoke about vendor managed inventory, and specifically in vendor managed inventory, we took this example that there are people stocking the shelves of Publix who are not employees of Publix. They could be employees for Coca-Cola or for Frito-Lay's, but they're just there managing the inventory. So in this case, the supplier or Frito-Lay or Coca-Cola is deciding the timing and the quantity of shipments to the retailer. And the retailer is sharing information with the supplier. They're sharing the demand data and other information. And other information could be, are they doing some kind of sales promotion in their store? Is Publix doing a store-wide discount coupon of 20% off? Or such kind of information which is specific to the retailer maybe. So once the supplier has these information, then they can better manage their inventory. So they are eliminating trade promotions. So vendor managed inventory is one of the ways of reducing the bullwhip effect. Okay. And we will see that vendor managed inventory is also a great way of managing incentive conflicts, which is where we are going next, right? Okay, so we understood the bullwhip effect. Then next up, we understood what supply chain coordination means, and then double marginalization, right? So because it's been a while since we met, so I'm gonna go over this also briefly, both the supply chain coordination as well as the double marginalization, just to help you come up to speed for what we did in the last classes. So supply chain, as you recall, is a system of organizations, people, activities, information, and resources which are involved in moving a product or supplier or service from supplier to the retailer. Okay, like all of these organizations, the people involved in those organizations, all of these come together and they make the supply chain for a particular product. And then all the products that we look around us and all the services that we look around us, they have some kind of a supply chain associated with them. So the computer that you're watching this video on was purchased from some kind of a retailer, like maybe Best Buy, um, but Best Buy was just the retailer. They did not manufacture the product, right? Somebody else manufactured it, then shipped it to a distributor, and then to a wholesaler, and then finally came to a retailer. And it's not necessary that all of these different firms would be a part of every supply chain, but this is just to give you a general picture of a supply chain. Okay, most items would have a supply chain much more complicated than this. The factory would be producing a product which comes from many different suppliers. Some of them might be domestic, some of them might be international. Then it would be sending its final product to many different distributors, and then you get the idea that this is just a simplistic idea of a supply chain. So within this simplistic idea of a supply chain, we understood that the material flows from the factory to the retailer, and then the information flows in the opposite direction. And then when we are going down, like going from factory to retailer, we call that going downstream. The idea being that the factory is like the source of the river, and so the water always flows downwards, right? Okay. So then what we were looking at is that this supply chain, the performance of the entire supply chain depends upon the actions taken by all the organizations in the supply chain. Okay, as a whole, this supply chain would depend upon each of the individual organizations, the retailer, the wholesaler, the distributor, and the factory. Okay. So in this case, each firm's objective is the optimization of its own performance, which can lead to less than optimal supply chain performance. So what do we mean by optimization of its own performance? It means everyone is maximizing their own profit. Okay, and which can lead to less than optimal supply chain performance, which means less than optimal maybe supply chain profit. So here the goal that we took was maximizing the profit as the objective, but the firms could have different objectives, like maximizing the customer service or maximizing the in-stock probability. Okay, but the key idea being that each of these different organizations within the supply chain, they're only working out of self-interest. So the key question here was, how do we tackle or coordinate the self-serving behavior of each member or player of the supply chain? Okay, so that's the question. So in this module of supply chain coordination, we explore two major challenges to supply chain coordination. The first one is the bullwhip effect, which is, this increase in the demand variability. And once we have that increase in the demand variability as we're moving up the supply chain, the supply chain performance is not optimal. It is suboptimal, because now sometimes we might end up with excess inventory, some other times we might not have enough. There'll be stockouts. So that was one of the challenges of supply chain coordination. Then the other one is incentive conflicts. Okay, So that's what the second topic that we're talking about. So incentive conflicts mean that everyone in the supply chain has different incentives to perform, and often they are conflicting to each other. Okay, an action that maximizes one firm's profit might not maximize another firm's profit. So let's take an example. So this retailer here sells to the end customer, okay, and this retailer purchases its product from the wholesaler. So let's just take that example of the beer game. Let's say you are the wholesaler, okay? This is who you are. So as a wholesaler, you sell your beers to the retailer, who in turn sells it to the end customer. So it cost you $1, or let's say it cost you $10 to purchase a case of beers, and you sell it at a wholesale price of $30. Then your wholesale price becomes the cost for the retailer, right? Because they pay you $30, and then they decide to sell that for $60. Okay, let's take the zeros off. Let's just for simplicity consider that a single beer costs $1 to make, and the wholesale price for the single beer is $3 for the wholesaler. Then the retailer buys that beer for $3, sells it for $6. Now, as a wholesaler, how do you make money? You make $2, okay, on every item that you sell. And as a retailer, you make $3 on every beer that you sell, right? So these are your margins. Okay, so the margin for the wholesaler is $2, for the margin for the retailer is $3. Now, how would the wholesaler be able to increase their margin? They can do it by increasing their wholesale price, right? By increasing their wholesale price. The cost, they could reduce it, try to make their processes more efficient, but it's not something that's very easily achieved. So the wholesale price, on the other hand, is more like a strategic variable that, okay, instead of selling it for $3, maybe I can sell it for $4. And if you sold it for $4, instead of 3, let's say you sold it for 4, then you would be making a margin of $3, right? So your margin increased. Per beer that you sold, you make $3 now instead of 2. But what happens? If you start selling it for $4, then of course the retailer has to buy it for $4, and their margin reduces to $2. Okay, so what's happening? So the wholesaler's incentive is directly clashing with the retailers. Okay, an action that maximizes one firm's profit might not maximize another firm's profit. So increasing the wholesale price clearly maximizes the wholesaler's profit, but it reduces the retailers. Okay, so in this case, everyone is practicing self-serving behavior. The manufacturer is thinking about itself, the distributor is thinking about itself, the wholesaler and the retailer, all of them are just going me, right? But it turns out that this leads to suboptimal performance, which means which means, what does suboptimal mean? It means less than the best, right? Less than best performance. And we'll see what does that mean. What does it mean that we didn't quite achieve the best performance that we could. All right. So coordination here means aligning the plans and objectives of individual firms in order to improve the overall supply chain performance, right? So what we're trying to do is we are trying to improve the overall supply chain performance. So when all of them decide to work together, towards a certain specific objective, then it turns out that maybe they can do better together. Okay, they can do better together, right? So then the incentive conflicts. As long as the incentive conflicts are present within a supply chain, the optimal supply chain performance is not guaranteed. It cannot be achieved, as long as everyone is acting according to their self-serving behavior, as we see here, self-serving behavior, it is not possible to achieve the optimal supply chain performance. So what we are going to do is explore the reasons behind this suboptimal performance. Okay, we're going to understand why this suboptimal performance comes about. And the answer is double marginalization, right? What we talked about last time, marginalization. Okay, and then once we understand that, then we will introduce some supply chain contracts in order to better coordinate the supply chain, in order to achieve this best profit that the supply chain can make together. So in order to do that, we were looking at this example, and this is your quiz question. So we looked at double marginalization at Umra Visage. So what the supply chain looks like in this case is, it looks like we have UV, which is the retailer. UV sells to the end customer and gets its product from Zematia. Right? Zematia is the one which is manufacturing the eyewear. And then they sell it to UV, who in turn sells it to the end customer. And then here we had something like Zematia has a really long supply chain. They have a long replenishment lead time. And the selling season is short, and the styles keep changing from year to year. So it turns out that they only receive one delivery. So once we read that, we were like, well, this looks like a news vendor problem. Short selling season, just one single chance of purchasing a product before the sale happens. So we understood that, okay, this is similar to the news vendor model or the news vendor problem. So what we had was we got some information about the economics of the problem. So in this case, UV, which sells to the customer, purchases their product, the sunglass, for $75. Okay, and then sells it to the end customer for $115. Then anything that is unsold, they get $25. Okay, so their salvage is $25. Then UV gets its product from Zematia and we had this information that Zematia, it cost them $35 to manufacture the product. This is production as well as shipping. And then what is their selling price? The selling price for Zematia is this price, right? The $75. Okay. And then the end customer has a demand which is normal, and the mean is equal to 250, and then the standard deviation is 125. All right. So in order to solve this problem, what we did was we started with this part of the problem, with UV's problem. Okay. And so we calculated the underage, we calculated the overage, the critical ratio, then we found out what the Q star is, and it turns out that the Q star is 234. So UV should be ordering 234. Okay, so UV should order 234 from Zematia. Okay, and then we found that for this 234 order quantity, what is the expected sales? So when they have 234 on shelf, they expect to sell on an average 192 of those sunglasses. And on an average, they are left behind with 42 sunglasses. And on an average, they make a profit of $5,580. Okay, so this was everything about UV, right? So once we know UV's problem, we find that Q star is equal to 234 and expected profit is equal to 5580, right? Then next up, we say that, okay, how do we find Zematia's profit? So how would we do that? So we know that Zematia gets an order of 234 from UV. So they can only sell 234, right? And on each one of the sunglasses that they sell, how much money do they make? They make 75 minus 35, or $40. So that's their margin. Okay. So they make 75 minus 35, and then they sell 234. And this turns out to be 9,360. So as a whole, how much money or how much profit did the supply chain make? And what do we mean by that? Zematia and UV put together. Okay, how much money do they make? So this person makes this one makes 5580, this one makes 9360. So overall put together they make 14,940. And that's how much profit the supply chain is making. And then what are the margins for both of them? For this guy, who it cost them 35 to make, okay, sell it at 75, so their margin is 40, and they purchase it at 75, sell it at 115, so their margin is also $40. Now it doesn't have to be equal. In this case it turns out to be equal, but again it doesn't have to be. Okay, so that's essentially what we had in the first case. Okay, so this is scenario 1. So then what we saw was that, okay, is this the optimal profit for the supply chain? And it turns out to be No, this is not the optimal profit, or this is not the maximum profit that the supply chain can make. No, not the maximum profit for total supply chain. Okay, and the reason behind that was because each firm is doing the best that it can to independently seek high profit margins. And this results in the price being higher and the sales volume and profits being lower than that of a vertically integrated firm. So what does it mean by a vertically integrated firm? So this idea actually goes back to way back to when Ford was selling its products. This terminology of vertically integrated firm. But here, to simplify it, what a vertically integrated firm means is that somehow Zematia and UV, they have become a single identity. Okay, maybe the manufacturer Zematia decided to purchase the retail location. So they still have their own physical locations which are independent of each other, but they're acting together as one single unit, maybe like factory outlets where the manufacturer, Adidas, owns the factory outlet. So if that's the case, then this integrated firm sells to the end customer. Okay. Then it turns out that for this vertically integrated firm, the profits are going to be higher than this case where they're independent of each other. Okay, where they're acting independently. All right. So this idea that we just looked at is called double marginalization. When each firm is acting out of their own self-interest and is adding their own margins to the final product. So this is called double margins, double marginalization. And it turns out to be inefficient. So the idea comes about that the retailer and the wholesaler, what is the relationship between both of them? And what I mean by that is there is UV, which purchases from Zematia, it's for $75, becomes 75 becomes their input, and then their selling price is 115. So this 75 is the transaction that happens between Zematia and UV, right? Now, as we looked at that, what Zematia would love to do is to increase their own margins. Like here they're making $40, but they would love to make $60 on every part that they sell, right? So they would love to increase their margins. But when that happens, when it increases its margin, maybe, sells it at $85 instead of 75, then what happens? What is happening is that Zematia is going to make a higher profit, right? Because hey, why not? They now make a higher margin on each product that they sell. But because if the 75 becomes 85, then UE is not going to make that much profit, right? Their profit reduces. Going from here, it reduces. So for Zamatia, it increases. For UE, it decreases. And overall supply chain profit also decreases. So the ideal way would be that the manufacturer actually reduces their wholesale price. So if the manufacturer reduces their wholesale price to 65, then it turns out that the overall supply chain profit actually increases, right? From 14,940, it goes up to 16,130. And then if they reduce it even further to $35, then the overall supply chain profit is 17,830. And the optimal Q also increases. Okay, so take a moment to look at this graph. What is happening here? So what is happening is that the wholesale price is that lever which Zamatia uses in order to change the overall supply chain profit. So what's the absolute minimum wholesale price that it can charge? The absolute minimum wholesale price that Zamatia can charge is $35, right? Because it costs them $35 to make that product. So of course they're not going to sell it for lesser than $35 because then they'll be making a loss on every item that they sell. But if it turns out that they reduce their wholesale price to $35, then they would make no money, right? Because they manufactured it at 35 and then they sold it at 35, so no money. But UE or Umbra, on the other hand, would be making a lot of profit. But the overall supply chain profit is very high, $17,830, okay, from this much, 14,940. So this is what we're going to look at. That essentially when you reduce the wholesale price, then first the split of profit changes. Okay, here the retailer was only getting this, this piece of the pie. Now they're getting a higher piece of the pie. Okay, right? Like here, when it was 75, when the wholesale price was 75, UE was making 5,580. You reduce it to 65. You reduce the wholesale price to 65, then UE makes $8,000, right? Because their margin increases. Okay, if their margin increases, so first they had a margin of 40, now their margin is 50, then of course they're going to make higher profit. And then if you reduce it even further, the entire pie of profit increases. Okay, so as a whole, the supply chain is making a higher profit than they were before. And this, the maximum profit pie, is when the retailer and the supplier are integrated. Okay, or Zamatia and UE, they are acting together as a single entity. So we need to understand what is the situation when they are integrated. Okay, so we do this by setting V equal to C, which is that the wholesale price V is equal to the cost of manufacturing the sunglasses, which is $35. Okay, and we call this integrated supply chain. So this is the second scenario that we are looking at. All right, when the wholesale price is equal to the production cost. So then we saw that what should be the optimal order quantity in this case. So what we have is we have Z/UV, which is because they're acting as one. The demand remains the same, mean 250, standard deviation 125. And here we have cost of 35, selling price remains the same, 115, salvage remains the same, 25. Then what would my Q star be? And it turns out to be 404, and then you calculated this in class, and then corresponding to this 404 we calculated the expected profit also, and we found that this 17,830 is actually higher than the 14,940. Okay, and this turns out to be the maximum profit that the supply chain can make. And then next up we compared these two. We said that okay, when they were in the first scenario, when they were both different, then the Q star was 234, they were making a profit of 14,940. When they're integrated, you know, when they're integrated, then in that case the Q star is 404 and they're making a overall profit of $17,830. So it turns out that overall there is an increase in the total supply chain profit by almost $3,000. But what's the problem here? The problem is the retailer is not making any money, or there is only one party which is making money. You know, you could either say that the manufacturer is making all the money, or you could say the retailer is making all the money, because they are because it's an integrated scenario, right? Because they are both kind of one and the same. So if there was some kind of a way that they both continue to exist independently, you know, Zimatia also remains and UV also remains, and they're able to make this much amount of profit, 17,830, then they would be better off. Then the entire supply chain would be better off. Okay, so one of the things to keep in mind is that this is the maximum total supply chain profit, and the way that we get it is by setting V equal to C. Okay, or in other words, when Z and UV become an integrated firm and sent to the end customer. So here we are saying that if we can find some kind of a way that that the retailer actually transfers some amount of money to the manufacturer, then they can both remain in the market, and the total supply chain profits can be optimized or maximized. All right. So then we looked at these questions, that why is it that a decentralized supply chain performs significantly worse than the vertically integrated one? Okay, significantly worse, like it's making almost $3,000 less. And also there is a difference of 170 units in the amount of material that Zymatia sells to the end customer. Here they're only having 234 on hand, and here they're having 404 on hand. Okay, so they're clearly doing worse. And the obvious answer is because the retailer does not order enough sunglasses. And the reason why it doesn't order enough sunglasses is because it's getting hit by those margins. Okay, because the wholesale price from the manufacturers is very high, right? The wholesale price was about $75, right? If it's that high, then of course, the the retailer doesn't make that much money. So, and if it doesn't make that much money, it's not gonna have a lot of products on in stock. But why does the manufacturer want to set a high wholesale price? Because it's also trying to make its own profit, maximize its own profit. It's acting in its own self-interest and it's trying to maximize its own profit. Okay, everybody clear? All right. So then we saw that supply chain contracts is actually the tool which is used to solve the incentive conflicts between the manufacturer and the retailer along the supply chain. Okay, so there are these incentive conflicts that manufacturer wants to increase their wholesale price, the retailer wants to reduce the wholesale price that they give to the manufacturer. So we need to find a way so that together as a supply chain they can still make that $17,830 but exist independently. So a good supply chain contract has two objectives. It should achieve the optimal performance of the supply chain or make maximum profit of, or whatever the maximum profit in that supply chain is. And each party on the supply chain earns a higher profit. So that means that the expected profit of manufacturer and expected profit of retailer should be higher than what it was before, implementing this contract. Okay, so that's the purpose of implementing a contract. Making a maximum supply chain profit of 17,830, which is the profit from the integrated supply chain. Okay, I represent pi as profits, and each party of the supply chain earns a higher profit. Okay, so we are going to introduce the following common contracts: buyback, revenue sharing, quantity flexibility, price protection, quantity discounts. Out of all of these, buybacks are the only one that we will numerically solve. The other ones we will conceptually understand how they work and how they can help achieve optimal performance within a supply chain. So buyback contracts is what we will be doing next. And right now what we have done is finished understanding everything that we did in the last two classes of supply chain performance. And the reason why I went into such detail when explaining it to you is because we had a long gap between our class meetings. So in order to make it easier for you to understand and follow along in the material that we do now, I made sure that you are up to speed on what we have done, and this will be very helpful to you to prepare for the exam, because now we have essentially touched upon the key topics that we covered in the last two classes or in supply chain coordination so far. So I'm going to stop right here and then come back and meet you in the next video, which will be on buyback contracts.